Nice bike. Funny though, someone dressed like you probably shouldn't own something like this. Hammer came down once, twice, three times, and an 800,000 motorcycle built by hand piece by piece over years of sacrifice began to die in an impound yard while two police officers laughed. The old biker standing a few feet away never moved, never shouted, never begged. He just watched and smiled the quietest, most dangerous smile anyone in that yard had ever seen. If you're new here, subscribe, hit the bell, and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go. The morning started the way most good mornings do, for men like William Harper. Coffee, silence, and the smell of motor oil. He sat at the small wooden table in the corner of his garage, the same table he'd been sitting at for 11 years since he'd retired, and he wrapped both hands around a chipped ceramic mug that said "World's okayest Grandpa" on the side. Granddaughter had given it to him as a joke. He used it every single day. Outside, the motorcycle waited. He could see it through the open garage door. Morning light hit the chrome the way. Morning light hits water clean, pure, almost religious. He'd spent more time looking at that machine than most men spend looking at anything beautiful in their entire lives. He was 62 years old. He had two bad knees, a lower back that argued with him every time he stood up too fast, and a scar along his left forearm that he never explained to anyone. His wife. He had buried two partners. He had sat across from killers, con men, and corrupt officials and never once let them see him sweat. And now, after all of that, he finally had one thing that belonged only to him, that motorcycle. He set the mug down. He pulled on his leather vest, the one covered in patches that meant nothing to most people, and everything to the men who recognized them. He walked to the machine, ran one hand along the gas tank the way you'd touch the shoulder of someone you loved, and he swung his leg over the seat. He had no idea that in 4 hours that motorcycle would be destroyed. He had no idea that the two men who destroyed it would spend the next 6 months wishing they had never gotten out of bed that morning. The engine, and he rode. The road from Harper's house to the Rusty Anchor Diner was 47 miles of two-lane highway that cut through farmland and pine trees and the occasional small town that still had a barbershop with a spinning pole out front. He knew every turn, every pothole, every stretch where the road opened up wide and smooth and you could let the engine breathe. The Hells Angels chapter he rode with had been meeting at the Rusty Anchor on the second Saturday of every month for 9 years. It wasn't an official thing. It was just what they did. They showed up. They ate breakfast. They drank bad coffee. They talked about their bikes, their families, and whatever was happening in the world, and then they rode together for a few hours before going home. Outsiders saw the patches and the leather and made their assumptions. They always made their assumptions. What they didn't see was Danny Ortega, who spent every Tuesday volunteering at the county food bank and had been doing it for 12 years. What they didn't see was Big Ray Hutchinson, who had built a wheelchair ramp for an elderly neighbor, a woman he barely knew just because he noticed she was struggling to get to her front door. What they didn't see was Tommy Briggs, who'd lost his son to a drug overdose 8 years ago and now drove 2 hours every weekend to speak at recovery meetings and talk to kids who were walking the same road his boy had walked. These were the men William Harper called brothers, not because they'd signed a paper, not because they'd taken an oath, because when his wife died, when Patricia died, these men showed up at his house at 6 a.m. with food and tools, and they fixed his broken fence and painted his peeling front porch and sat with him in silence when silence was all he had to offer. They never asked him to explain himself. They never treated him like he was fragile. They just showed up. That meant more to him than 30 years of commendations and plaques and handshakes from people in expensive suits. He pulled into the parking lot of the Rusty Anchor at 9:30, and he was. There were already 7 bikes lined up along the front of the building. He recognized all of them. Danny's old Softail with the dented left exhaust, Big Ray's wide glide that was somehow still running despite looking like it had survived a war, Tommy's bike, which was always clean, always perfect, because Tommy believed that how you cared for your machine said something about how you cared for yourself. Harper parked at the end of the row. He climbed off slowly the left knee, announcing its presence the way it always did, and he stood there for a moment, looking back at his motorcycle the way you look back at someone you've just met and already know you're going to remember. He walked inside. There he is, Danny called out from the back booth. The boy himself. 2 months late, but he finally shows up with the bike. 2 months and 4 days, Harper said, sliding into the seat across from him. Friend, you actually counted? I count everything. Old habit. The waitress, a woman named Carol, who had been working at the Rusty Anchor longer than most of their bikes had been in existence, appeared at the table with a coffee pot and the specific expression of a woman who had seen every possible variation of human behavior and was no longer surprised by any of it. Same as always, she asked Harper. Swigs, 2 eggs toast, and whatever's left of your patience, he said, bite herself and walked away. Danny leaned forward. Let's hear it. How does it ride? Like a dream that cost more than my house. How much did it actually cost? Harper wrapped his hands around the coffee mug Carol had already placed in front of him. And I should have spent. Harper, $800,000. The table went quiet for exactly 2 seconds. Then Big Ray, who was sitting at the next table with Tommy and a man named Garrett, who everyone called Dusty for reasons that had been forgotten years ago, turned around with wide eyes. $800,000. For a motorcycle? For a one-of-a-kind, hand-built, custom-fabricated motorcycle that took 3 years to design and 18 months to build. Harper said, that's a house. Tommy said, I have a house. That's 2 houses. I don't need 2 houses. Big Ray shook his head slowly. I genuinely cannot tell if you're the smartest man at this table or the biggest idiot. Experience. Harper said those are usually the same person. He took a long sip of his coffee. Outside through the diner window, his motorcycle sat in the morning light, beautiful and still and completely unaware of what was coming. Deputy Cole Bennett was the kind of man who had spent his entire adult life looking for situations where he had the advantage. He had figured out early, sometime around his junior year of high school, the wrestling team, not because he loved the sport, but because he loved pinning people to the mat and watching their faces that the world was divided into 2 kinds of people. People who had power and people who didn't. He had spent every year since then making sure he stayed on the right side of that line. The badge helped. The badge helped enormously. It was not that Cole Bennett was purely evil. Most people who do wrong aren't purely evil. There's something more ordinary and more dangerous. They're people who have convinced themselves that the rules don't apply to them, and they've never been confronted by anyone strong enough to prove otherwise. Deputy Ryan Miller was different in the details, but identical in the essence. Cole was aggressive and loud. Ryan was quiet and watchful. He preferred to let Cole take the lead. He preferred to stand slightly behind and let events unfold, only stepping in when there was something to gain. For 3 years. In 3 years, they had filed 14 complaints against motorcyclists, and none of those complaints had ever resulted in a conviction. But 3 of those motorcyclists had lost their bikes to impound, and none of those bikes had ever been returned. This was the game they played. Find someone they thought was vulnerable. Find a reason, any reason. It didn't need to be a good reason, just a reason, and exercise whatever authority they could stretch to its breaking point. See what happened. See if the person could fight back. Most of them couldn't. Most of them didn't even know they were supposed to try. Cole Bennett spotted the motorcycle from across the highway. He was sitting in his cruiser at a gas station on the other side of the road, eating a sandwich, when the black machine with the custom chrome trim pulled into the Rusty Anchor parking lot and settled into a space at the end of a row of bikes. He sat up a little straighter. He had seen expensive motorcycles before. He knew enough to know that what he was looking at was not ordinary. The finish was too perfect. The chrome was too detailed. The whole machine had the quality of something that had been made one time for one person and would never be made again. Ryan, he said. Miller looked up from his phone. Look at that bike. Looked. A slow smile moved across his face. Nice, Cole agreed. Real nice. He finished his sandwich. He crumpled the wrapper and tossed it in the back seat of the cruiser. Let's go say hello, he said. They sat in the parking lot for 40 minutes. Harper didn't know this. He was inside eating his eggs and listening to Big Ray tell a story about a camping trip that had gone wrong in at least 4 different ways. The table was loud with laughter. Carol kept refilling coffee without being asked. Outside, Cole and Ryan sat in the cruiser and watched the motorcycle. All ran the plate. The registration came back clean. The insurance was current. The vehicle identification number matched the title on record. There was nothing wrong. There was nothing even slightly irregular. This was not, in Cole Bennett's experience, a problem. A lack of evidence was not an obstacle. It was an opportunity to be creative. Harper finally walked out of the diner. It was close to noon. He was alone. He'd said his goodbyes inside, told the group he was heading home before the afternoon heat set in. He was zipping his vest when he heard the cruiser door open. "Excuse me." He turned around. Cole Bennett was already walking toward him with the easy confidence of a man who has never once been told no by someone he was approaching in a parking lot. "That your bike?" Cole asked, nodding toward the motorcycle. Harper said, "Nice bike." Cole tilted his head slightly. "Funny, though. Someone dressed like you probably shouldn't own something like this." Harper looked at him, not with anger, not with fear, with the specific, quiet look of a man who has spent 30 years assessing people in the first 30 seconds of meeting them, and is now, in this moment, completing his assessment. And it was exactly what he appeared to be. "That was the dangerous kind." "I have the documentation," Harper said. "Registration, title, insurance." "See it?" "Sure," Cole said. "Let's see it." Harper reached into his vest and produced a folded envelope that he kept in an interior pocket. He handed it over. Cole took it, opened it, made a show of examining each document with the slow deliberateness of a man performing authority. Miller had come around the other side and was standing near the rear of the motorcycle, looking it over the way you look at something you've already decided you're going to take. "Where'd you get the money for this?" Cole asked. "Saved it," Harper said. "How long?" "Long time." "Doing what?" "Working," Harper said. "Same as everyone." Cole handed the documents back. He looked at the motorcycle. He looked at Harper. He looked at the patches on the vest, the Hells Angels insignia that he'd been trained in the academy to treat as a criminal indicator, a shorthand for danger and wrongdoing, a signal that everything about the person wearing it was probably suspicious. "I'm going to need to take the bike in," Cole said. Harper was very still. "On what grounds?" "Suspected stolen property." "I just showed you the documentation." "Documentation can be falsified." "Not by 3 separate government agencies, it can't." Cole smiled. It was not a friendly smile. "Sir, I'm asking you to cooperate with a law enforcement investigation. If the bike is clean, you'll have it back in no time." Harper looked at him for a long moment. He said nothing. And in that silence, in that long evaluating, completely unreadable silence, Cole Bennett made the fundamental mistake that would define the next 6 months of his life. He interpreted Harper's silence as submission. He thought the old biker had run out of options. He thought he'd won. The tow truck arrived 20 minutes later. By that point, 3 of Harper's brothers had come out of the diner. Danny, Big Ray, and Tommy stood in a loose group near the entrance, watching. Faces were tight. Their jaws were clenched. Big Ray had his arms crossed over his chest in the specific posture of a man who is exercising enormous self-control. Danny said quietly, moving to stand beside him. "No," Harper said. "Just that one word. They can't just..." "Danny," he turned and looked at him. Something in his eyes made Danny stop talking immediately. "I need you to trust me." Danny looked at him for a moment. Then he nodded and stepped back. Cole Bennett watched this exchange with the smug satisfaction of a man who has just confirmed his assessment of a situation. The old biker was backing down. His friends were backing down. This was going exactly the way he'd planned. He didn't notice the small device mounted near the front of the motorcycle's instrument cluster. It looked like part of the original hardware, a custom edition, something a hobbyist might install. It was a camera, high definition, wide angle, activated remotely. And for the last 22 minutes, since the moment Cole Bennett first stepped out of that cruiser and walked toward the motorcycle, it had been recording. The tow truck operator, a young guy, maybe 25, who clearly wanted no part of whatever was happening, hooked up the bike and began the loading process. Harper watched. His face was completely calm. Danny, standing a few feet away, would later tell people that watching Harper in that moment was one of the strangest experiences of his life, because Danny Ortega was furious. He was so angry he could feel his own pulse in his temples. Here was William Harper, his brother, the man whose machine was being stolen in broad daylight by 2 officers who were clearly abusing their authority, and Harper looked like a man who was watching a chess match from a comfortable distance, like he already knew how it ended. "This is wrong," Tommy said, keeping his voice low. Yes, Harper agreed. It is. Then why aren't you stopping it? Harper turned and looked at him. I am stopping it. This is just the slow version. The impound yard was on the edge of the county, behind a chain-link fence topped with rusting barbed wire. It was the kind of place that smelled like old rubber and bad decisions. Vehicles were parked in uneven rows, cars with flat tires, trucks with shattered windshields, the occasional motorcycle lying on its side like something that had given up. Harper's motorcycle in 1:47 in the afternoon. At 2:12, Cole Bennett walked into the yard. Harper had been allowed to follow in his own vehicle. Technically, they couldn't stop him, and he was standing near the chain-link gate when Cole walked past him without a word, went to where the motorcycle was parked, and picked up a hammer that had been leaning against the fence post. Harper watched. He understood immediately what was happening. This was not impoundment. This was not investigation. This was destruction. This was a man who had decided that the exercise of power wasn't complete until the evidence of that power was permanent and visible and impossible to reverse. Cole raised the hammer, brought it down on the fuel tank. The sound that followed was something that Danny Ortega, who had arrived at the gate a few minutes behind Harper, later described as the worst sound he had ever heard in his life. Worse than any accident, worse than any crash, because it wasn't random destruction. It was intentional. It was deliberate. It was one person choosing to erase something another person had spent years building and doing it with a smile on his face. He grabbed the fence. Harper, don't, Harper said. I know, Harper, he's destroying your bike. I know, Danny. Then Harper reached out and put one hand on Danny's forearm. His voice was low, almost gentle, because every swing of that hammer is going to cost him more than he knows, and I need him to keep swinging. Danny stared at him. Cole hit the headlight. The chrome shattered. Ryan Miller was standing nearby with his thumbs in his belt loops, watching with the expression of a man watching a movie he'd already seen but still enjoyed. The other members of the Hells Angels, who had gathered at the fence, were barely contained. Big Ray was breathing hard through his nose. Dusty had his hands pressed flat against the chain link, like he was holding himself back through pure physical effort. And Harper stood among them, like a man standing in the eye of a storm. Unaffected, not without feeling, his jaw was tight. His hands, hidden in his vest pockets, were clenched so hard that his knuckles would be white for an hour afterward. Because that motorcycle was not just money. It was not just a machine. The first thing he had ever allowed himself to want purely for himself after a lifetime of serving other people. Years of deferred gratification and personal sacrifice made physical and beautiful and real. And they were destroying it. And he was letting them, because William Harper had not spent 30 years investigating corruption by acting on impulse. He had spent 30 years investigating corruption by being patient, by being thorough, by making sure that when the moment of accountability came, there was not a single crack in the case through which the guilty could escape. Cole brought the hammer down a fourth time, a fifth. By the sixth strike, the fuel tank had collapsed inward. The eighth, the custom handlebars were bent beyond recognition. By the 12th, what had been an 800,000 motorcycle was becoming an 800,000 pile of evidence. Camera recorded every second of it, every swing, every laugh, every word Cole said to Ryan between strikes, every expression on both of their faces, every moment of casual, contemptuous, completely unguarded cruelty. Cole Bennett destroyed that motorcycle with the confidence of a man who has done this before and never once faced a consequence. He had no idea he was building his own case. He had no idea that the quiet old biker at the fence, the man he had dismissed, humiliated in the span of an afternoon, had just turned his cruelest moment into a document that would be reviewed by federal investigators within 72 hours. He had no idea that William Harper, former federal special agent with 30 years of experience, and a network of colleagues who still answered his calls on the first ring, was already composing in his mind the exact words he would say when he made the phone call that night. The hammer came down a 13th time, and Harper finally looked away, not because he couldn't watch anymore, but because he had seen enough. To Danny, "Get everyone home safe," he said quietly. "What are you going to do?" Danny asked. Harper zipped his vest. He put on his sunglasses. He turned and walked toward the parking lot without hurrying, without looking back, without any outward sign of what was happening inside him. "I always do," he said. He got in his truck. He drove home. And Cole Bennett went back to his cruiser and never once thought about what he had just started. Harper sat at his kitchen table in the dark for a long time before he turned on the light. The house was quiet, the way houses get quiet when they've been empty for years. Not empty of things. There were pictures on the walls, books on shelves, a coffee maker on the counter that had seen 11 years of mornings, but empty of the particular warmth that comes from another person being in the next room. Marisha had been gone for 6 years. He still set 2 coffee mugs out every morning. He'd stopped trying to break the habit. Some habits he'd decided were worth keeping. He sat down. He opened his laptop. He watched the footage from the camera on his motorcycle. He watched it 3 times. The first time, he felt the anger that he'd kept behind his teeth all afternoon. Came through him in a wave, clean and hot and honest, and he let it. He didn't try to suppress it. He had learned long ago that anger suppressed doesn't disappear. It just goes underground and does its damage from there. The second time, he watched it like an investigator, analytically, cataloging every piece of information, timestamps, the faces, the specific language, the property, the witnesses, the chain of command, everything that would need to be documented, verified, and presented. The third time, he watched it and thought about all the other people who had stood where he stood and not been able to do anything. That was the moment the decision fully formed. He picked up his phone. He scrolled to a number he hadn't dialed in 4 years. Rang twice, Mr. Harper. The voice on the other end was surprised but not alarmed. A voice that had learned to stay steady under any circumstances. Harper said, "I need your help." A pause. Happened. 2 deputies destroyed an 800,000 motorcycle I own. I have it on video. Are you hurt? No. Okay. Another pause, shorter this time. "This is the first call I've gotten from you in 4 years, Harper. I know you didn't call me over a motorcycle." Harper looked at the dark window across the kitchen. "I called other riders tonight," he said, "after I got home. 6 of them have had their bikes impounded by these same 2 deputies in the last 18 months. None of the bikes were returned. None of the cases went anywhere. 2 of the men were threatened when they tried to file complaints." Silence on the line. "How many victims total, do you think?" Marcus asked. "I don't know yet," Harper said. "That's why I'm calling you." Silence. "Send me the footage," Marcus said. "Already sent." A pause. Harper could hear typing on the other end. Marcus said slowly. This footage is, you watched this and just stood there?" "I needed them to finish," Harper said simply. A long, low exhale on the other end of the line. "I forget sometimes," Marcus said, "what you're actually like." "I need this done right," Harper said. "Not fast." "Right. Understood. I'll make some calls tonight. We'll have investigators pulling records by tomorrow morning." "Don't thank me yet," Marcus said. "Thank me when they're in handcuffs." Almost smiled. "That works too," he said. He hung up. He sat in the quiet kitchen for another hour. He thought about Patricia, the way he always did when things were hard, because she had been better at this than him, better at sitting with difficulty, better at maintaining perspective, better at remembering that the outcome was not always within your control, and that the only thing you could truly govern was how you showed up. "You always made things so complicated," he could almost hear her saying. "You always chose the hardest road." "Yeah," he said quietly to the empty kitchen. He reached out and set the second coffee mug, the empty one, the one that was always there, slightly closer to the center of the table. Then he went to bed. Tomorrow it would begin. The next morning, Marcus Webb did not make one phone call. He made 11, and by 6:45 in the morning, before most people in the county had finished their first cup of coffee, separate federal contacts had been reached, and 2 records requests had been initiated through official channels. One former colleague of Harper's, a woman named Diane Castillo, who now worked internal affairs at the state level and who had a reputation for being the kind of person that corrupt officers genuinely feared, had already pulled the personnel files for deputies Cole Bennett and Ryan Miller, called Harper at 7:03. "You're going to want to sit down," he said. "I'm already sitting," Harper said. He was at the kitchen table. Mugs, 1 full. "These 2 men have 14 internal complaints filed against them in 3 years. Harper said nothing. 14, Harper. And not one of them resulted in a formal disciplinary action. Not one. The complaints were filed, reviewed, and closed. Every single one of them. Who was reviewing them? That's the interesting part, Marcus said. And his voice had the specific quality of a man who has found something he wasn't expecting and is now trying to decide how deep the hole goes. 3 different reviewing officers, but all 3 of them report to the same supervisor. Department, Western District. Captain Gerald Farrow. I know that name, Harper said slowly. You should. He's been with the department for 22 years. Clean record, community commendations, coached Little League for a decade apparently. And 2 of the 14 complaints were filed directly against him. Closed within 72 hours, no investigation, no documentation of any interview conducted, nothing. Harper set his coffee mug down. That's not a cover-up by 2 rogue deputies, he said. System, that's what I'm looking at, Marcus said. And Harper Diane found 3 motorcycle impounds tied directly to Bennett and Miller in the last 18 months. 3 separate bikes, none returned. All 3 owners are in the same community as your riders. All 3 filed complaints. All 3 complaints were reviewed and closed by officers under Farrow's supervision. The kitchen was very quiet. The money, Harper said. Where do impounded vehicles go when they aren't claimed or returned? They go to county auction, Marcus said carefully. And the auction proceeds? Another pause, longer this time. On that, Marcus said. But Harper, if what I think I'm looking at is what I think I'm looking at, then it's not about the bikes, Harper said. No, Marcus agreed. It's not about the bikes. Harper picked up his coffee again. His hand was steady. How long do you need, he asked. 72 hours to build something solid enough to move on. Have it, Harper said. But, Marcus, yeah, do it right. Fast. Right. You already said that last night. I'm saying it again this morning. A short silence, and then Marcus almost laughed. You know what I missed about working with you, Harper? Absolutely nothing about this conversation. Harper did smile this time, just barely. I'll call you tonight, he said, and hung up. He sat for a moment in the quiet kitchen. Then he reached out, picked up the second mug, the empty one, and moved it to the dish rack. Not because he'd stopped missing her, but because today he needed the table clear. He had work to do. 3 miles across town, Cole Bennett was eating breakfast at a fast food counter and telling Ryan Miller about a fishing trip he was planning for the following weekend. He had not thought about William Harper once since leaving the impound yard the previous afternoon. The cycle was gone. The old biker had stood there and taken it without putting up a real fight. The whole thing had lasted maybe 45 minutes from first contact to resolution, and now it was done. That was the thing about people like Cole Bennett. The operation completed, they moved on immediately. No reflection, no second guessing. Because second guessing required the ability to imagine that you might have been wrong, and Cole Bennett had not seriously entertained that possibility in years. He looked up. A patrol sergeant named Rodriguez was standing at the counter with a look on his face that Cole couldn't quite read. Captain wants to see you, Rodriguez said. Both of you. His office now. Cole exchanged a glance with Ryan. Ryan's expression didn't change, but his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. For, Cole asked. He didn't tell me what for, Rodriguez said evenly. He told me to get you, so I got you. Cole shrugged and pushed his tray aside. Probably about the weekend schedule, he said to Ryan, in the tone of a man who has explained away 100 things he didn't understand. Ryan said nothing. He had a feeling, the specific, low, cold feeling of a man who is better at reading situations than his partner, that it was not about the weekend schedule. Captain Gerald Farrow was 61 years old, and he had the kind of face that photographs well at community events. Jaw, steady eyes, silver at the temples. He had given the commencement speech at the police academy 2 years in a row. His daughter had gotten married the previous spring, and the department had sent flowers. He was, by every visible measure, exactly what he appeared to be. Which was why, when Cole and Ryan walked into his office and saw the expression on his face, Cole's certainty began for the first time to wobble. Was seated behind his desk. He did not stand when they came in. He did not gesture for them to sit. He looked at them across the surface of the desk with a silence that lasted just long enough to be uncomfortable. Close the door, he said. Ryan closed it. Tell me about the motorcycle, Farrow said. Cole kept his posture easy. Impound from yesterday. Suspected stolen property. Old biker over by the rusty anchor on Route 9. The bike didn't check out, so we had it pulled. The bike didn't check out, Farrow repeated. Cole. Farrow's voice didn't rise. Registration was clean. The title was clean. The insurance was current. The VIN matched the record. I have the database pull from yesterday sitting in front of me right now. And everything checked out. The silence that followed was different from the one before it. Cole's jaw worked for a moment. There were inconsistencies. There were no inconsistencies, Pharaoh said. There was a legal vehicle owned by a man you decided to harass because of how he was dressed, and now that vehicle has been damaged on county property while in county custody. Completely still. Cole said, Captain, I don't think the owner filed a formal complaint this morning, Pharaoh said. He picked up a single sheet of paper from the desk and held it so they could see it without reading it. Through federal channels. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Federal, Ryan said. It was the first word he'd spoken. Pharaoh confirmed. He set the paper down. That means it doesn't come to me for review. It doesn't go through my desk. It goes to people I cannot manage, cannot call, and cannot help you with. He looked at them both in turn. Understand what I'm telling you? Cole said, who is this guy? That, Pharaoh said, is the question you should have asked before you picked up a hammer. Back at his kitchen table, Harper had spent the morning going through his phone contacts with the methodical patience of a man sorting through a very specific filing system that exists entirely in his own memory. He had names. He had numbers. He had 30 years of relationships built through the specific kind of trust that only comes from having been in difficult situations together and come out the other side still standing. His phone rang at 10:17. It was Danny. I've been talking to people, Danny said without preamble. After last night, I started making calls. Writers from the chapter, people I know in other chapters. I've got 5 more guys who had bikes taken by those same 2 deputies. Harper said I know about 3. 5, Danny repeated. You know about plus 2 more. One of them, guy named Phil Reeves, rides out of the Westbrook chapter. His bike was taken 8 months ago. He filed a complaint within 48 hours. 3 days later, someone slashed all 4 tires on his personal vehicle. He withdrew the complaint the next morning. The pause that followed was sharp and waited into silence, Harper said. The man has a wife and 2 kids, Danny said. His voice was tight. He wasn't willing to risk it. Is he willing to talk now? I told him what happened to your bike. I told him that somebody was actually doing something about it. He said, Danny paused briefly. He said, if you're involved, he'll talk. Harper set down his pen. He knows who I am. He knows who you are, Danny confirmed. Harper, half the people in these chapters know who you are. They just never said anything because you never said anything. I value my privacy, Harper said. Yeah, well, Danny said, privacy is getting people's bikes stolen and their tires slashed. So maybe it's time to let a little of it go. It's blunter than Danny usually spoke to him. Harper recognized it as the kind of bluntness that comes from genuine feeling. Set up a meeting, Harper said. Whoever will talk. Neutral location. I'll be there when? Tonight. Pause. How many people are we talking? Everyone, Harper said. Every single person who was afraid to say something. Because the only reason those officers kept doing this is because they believed nobody would stand up. And to show them they miscalculated. The meeting happened at Big Ray's garage, which was large enough to hold 20 people comfortably and was on private property with no sight lines from the road. 23 people showed up. Some of them drove 40 minutes to get there. Phil Reeves, the one whose tires had been slashed, drove 1 hour and 12 minutes with his hands tight on the wheel the entire way. Harper stood in the center of the garage and looked at them. These were not powerful people by conventional definitions. They were mechanics and veterans and construction workers and small business owners. They wore leather and denim and work boots. Several of them had records, minor offenses, old things. The kind of history that makes people in authority assume you are lesser than you are. They were not lesser. They were exactly the kind of people that the system was designed to make feel like they had no recourse. And they were looking at Harper, waiting to hear that they did. I'm not going to waste your time with a long speech, Harper said. You came here because something was done to you and you want it addressed. I'm here to tell you it's going to be. But I need to hear it from you first. Happened. When? And whether you're willing to put your name on it. Spoke first. He was a compact man in his mid-40s, with careful eyes and the kind of deliberate manner that suggested someone who thought before he spoke. He described the impound in detail, the pretextual stop, the documentation he had produced. Bennett had looked at his bike the same way. Cole had looked at Harper's with the specific evaluative hunger of a man identifying a target. He described filing the complaint. He described coming out to his driveway 2 mornings later to find his tires destroyed. He described calling the complaint office to withdraw his report. My daughter was supposed to be in that car the next morning, he said. She had a school trip. I drive her to the meeting point every time. He stopped. They didn't slash tires. They slashed my ability to pretend my family was safe. It was very quiet. Then a man in the back, a heavy-set veteran named Marcus Lee, who had said nothing since he arrived, spoke up. They took my bike 14 months ago. I filed a complaint because I looked up the complaint process and saw it goes to the same department. I thought, what's the point? I just ate the loss. He shook his head slowly. I shouldn't have had to eat that loss. One after another, they spoke. 8. 6 formal complaints, all closed without action. 3 instances of apparent retaliation. One man who had been threatened verbally and directly by Cole Bennett when he asked questions about the impound process. One woman, the girlfriend of a rider who hadn't come, but had sent her with his account, who had been told by Ryan Miller that if her boyfriend kept making noise, there would be more problems. By the time the room was done, Harper had filled 4 pages in a small notebook. Is this enough? Danny asked quietly, standing beside him. It's more than enough, Harper said. He looked around the room. I want to be clear with all of you about something. What happens next is a legal process. It will take time. It will require patience, and it will require every one of you to trust that the outcome is coming even when it doesn't feel like it. He paused. I know that's a hard thing to ask. Patience is always harder than action. I am telling you not as a promise I hope to keep, but as a statement of what is already in motion, that the people who did this to you are going to be held accountable. Phil Reeves looked at him across the garage. How can you be sure? Harper met his eyes. Because I've done this before, he said simply. And because this time it's personal. What Harper did not know, what none of them knew that night, in Big Ray's garage, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead and the smell of motor oil and coffee in the air, was that while they were meeting, Cole Bennett was doing something that would accelerate everything. He was making a mistake. After the meeting with Captain Farrow, Cole had spent the afternoon in a state of controlled unease that he refused to name as fear. He told himself it was irritation. He told himself it was the general frustration of dealing with a system that sometimes complicated simple things. He told himself that the federal complaint meant nothing, because federal complaints filed by leather vest-wearing bikers got deprioritized all the time. He told himself a lot of things, but at 8:15 in the evening, he drove to the impound yard. He had told himself he was going to assess the situation, look at the evidence, decide whether there was anything that needed to be managed. It was a reasonable thing to do, he told himself. It was exactly what a responsible officer would do in his position. He walked to where the motorcycle had been left, after he'd worked on it the previous afternoon. He looked at it for a long time. The damage was substantial. Substantial than he'd maybe registered in the moment of doing it. The fuel tank was crushed. The headlight assembly was destroyed. The handlebars were bent at an angle that made the whole machine look broken, in the way living things look broken after an accident. He reached out and adjusted something on the instrument cluster, a small component that had been knocked loose. He didn't know what it was. He had no way of knowing that the camera was still active, that it had been recording from the moment he walked into the yard, that his face turns. In this moment, it's being captured with a timestamp of 8:23 p.m. on the evening following the original destruction, running to the scene of the damage he had caused. He didn't know. He stood there for 4 minutes and 20 seconds looking at the ruined motorcycle. Then he turned and walked back to his cruiser and drove home. When Marcus Webb reviewed the footage the following morning, he called Harper at 6:58. He went back, Marcus said. Harper said nothing. Last night, 8:23 p.m., he walked into the impound yard and stood at the motorcycle for 4 minutes and change. On camera, Harper was quiet for a moment. He knows there's a complaint filed, which means he went back to assess his exposure, Marcus said, which means he was thinking about whether there was anything he needed to deal with, which means this isn't impulsive behavior, this is calculated behavior. That's a very different legal profile, Harper. I know, Harper said. We already had intent from the original footage. Now we have consciousness of guilt. When do your people move? A pause. We're looking at Thursday. 2 days. We need the audit trail from the auction proceeds completed first. I have to tell you, what we're finding in the financial records is not small. How not small? Over 36 months, county auction proceeds from impounded vehicles show irregularities totaling somewhere in the range of $400,000. It was moved through an intermediary account attached to a shell company, registered in the name of a relative of someone in the department. Still tracing it, but the structure is Harper. Someone built this. Someone built it deliberately. This was not opportunistic. This was a system designed to extract money from people who couldn't fight back. Harper gripped the phone. Bennett and Miller are the front end, Harper said slowly. The visible part, the people who do the actual taking. And someone else built the back end, Marcus confirmed. Someone who knew how to move money. Pharaoh, Harper said. We don't have his name on the account yet, Marcus said carefully. Close. The kitchen was very quiet. Harper thought about Phil Reeves, driving an hour and 12 minutes with his hands tight on the wheel. He thought about the man in the back of Ray's garage, who had eaten his loss because he thought what was the point. He thought about the woman who had passed along her boyfriend's account of a threat made to his face by a man with a badge. Thursday, Harper said. Thursday, Marcus confirmed. I'll be there. Harper, you won't be operationally involved. Matt? I know, Harper said. But I'll be there. Aware. Wherever they are when it happens, Harper said. I want to see their faces. Danny called at noon. Word is getting around, he said. I didn't spread it, but you know how this community works. People talk. I'm getting calls from riders I haven't spoken to in 3 years, asking if it's true that something is actually happening. Are you telling them? Harper asked. I'm telling them to be patient and stay out of the way, Danny said. Is that the right thing to say? It's exactly the right thing to say. Danny's voice shifted, something more personal underneath the logistics. I ask you something? Yes. Why didn't you ever tell us? About who you were, about your career. We've been riding together for 11 years, and I found out who you really are from a phone call with a stranger from another chapter. Harper was quiet for a moment, because when I came to this group, he said finally, I wasn't looking for respect based on my past. I was looking for belonging based on who I actually was. The man who showed up, not the badge, not the career. Me. A long silence on Danny's end. Well, Danny said quietly, for what it's worth. The man who showed up was worth knowing. Harper felt something move in his chest. Uncomfortable and warm at the same time. Don't get sentimental on me, Danny, he said. I need you focused. I'm always focused, Danny said, and Harper could hear the smile in it. Thursday, Harper said. Stay close to your phone. He hung up. He looked at the notebook on the table. 4 pages of names and accounts and dates. 11 years of riding with men who had never asked him to be anything other than what he was, and 2 deputies who had taken something from all of them. Day was 2 days away. He was very patient. He had been patient his entire life, but there was a particular quality to this patience now, a tight, coiled, quiet quality that was different from anything he'd felt in years. Because this time the waiting was not passive. The waiting was the last step before arrival. Like the moment just before you open a door, you know, contains everything you've been working toward. Harper closed the notebook. He picked up his coffee. He looked at the empty space across the table where the second mug used to be. 2 more days, Patricia, he said quietly. Then he got back to work. Wednesday night, Harper did not sleep. Not because he was anxious. He had passed the point of anxiety sometime in his late 30s, after his 3rd major undercover operation had gone sideways in a way that could have ended with him in a ditch, and he had spent 48 hours not knowing if he was going to make it out. After that, anxiety had become something he recognized as a visitor rather than a resident. It showed up. He acknowledged it. He let it move through. What kept him awake Wednesday nights was something different. It was the specific, alert, humming quality of a man who is very close to something and knows it, like a frequency just above hearing range that you feel in your chest rather than your ears. He lay in the dark and ran through everything. The footage from the motorcycle camera, cataloged, time-stamped, backed up in 3 separate locations. The witness accounts from Big Ray's garage, 23 people, 8 separate incidents, documented in a format that Marcus's team had reviewed and confirmed was legally solid. The financial trail that Marcus had spent 72 hours reconstructing irregularities across 36 months, earned $400,000. A shell company, relatives, a pit that someone had built carefully and slowly, and with the confidence of a person who believed they would never be examined this closely. The return, visitors, Cole Bennett, standing in an impound yard at 8:23 in the evening, looking at the thing he had done, captured on a camera he didn't know existed. It was solid. It was more than solid. It was the kind of case that Harper had built dozens of times in his career and recognized by the specific weight of it, the way it settled, complete and interlocking, with no loose edges that a defense attorney could pull at and unravel. He thought about Captain Gerald Farrow, the man with the square jaw and the Little League record and the community commendations, the man who had built a machine for extracting money from people who didn't know they had the right to fight back and had run it for 3 years behind the face of an upstanding public servant. Harper had met men like Farrow many times in his career, in some ways more troubling than the straightforwardly violent criminals, because the straightforwardly violent ones at least didn't bother to pretend. Farrow had looked his community in the eye for 22 years and smiled and shaken hands and coached children, and all the while had been building something underneath that smile that used the most vulnerable people in his jurisdiction as a revenue source. And that kind of corruption required a particular kind of coldness. Harper stared at the ceiling. At 3 in the morning, his phone vibrated on the nightstand. A text from Marcus. 4 words, "We're ready for tomorrow." Back 2 words. "So am I." He set the phone down. He closed his eyes. He did not exactly sleep, but he rested in the particular way of a man who has done everything that can be done and is now in the last hours before the thing happens and has made his peace with whatever comes next. At 5:30, he got up, made coffee, set out 2 mugs out of habit, and then stood at the kitchen counter and thought about Patricia for exactly as long as he allowed himself to think about her on mornings when he needed to be sharp. She had been a remarkable woman. Everyone who knew her said so. Harper knew it in a different way than most people, not as a general statement about her character, but as a specific, daily, accumulated knowledge of what it meant to live alongside someone who was fundamentally good. She had a temper. She could be impatient. She had opinions about his career that she expressed directly and without softening, because she believed that honesty between 2 people who loved each other was more respectful than comfortable silence. "You always take the long road," she used to say. "You always find the complicated way to do the simple thing." "The simple way doesn't always get the right result," he always answered. "And the complicated way does, more often than you'd think." She had shaken her head at him across 11 years of breakfast tables, and he had loved her for every single shake. He finished his coffee. He went to get ready. Today was Thursday. Webb arrived at Harper's house at 7:15 in a plain sedan with federal plates, wearing a suit that looked like it had been pressed at 5 in the morning, which it had. He was 54, trim with close-cropped gray hair, and the manner of a man who had spent 3 decades making difficult things happen quietly. He and Harper had worked together for 9 years before Harper retired, and in 9 years they had built the kind of working relationship that doesn't require explanation on either end. Each one already knew what the other needed before it was asked. "How are you holding up?" Marcus asked when Harper opened the door. Harper said, "That's always what you say, because it's always true." Just looked at him for a moment with the evaluating look of a man who knows fine is sometimes accurate and sometimes a performance, and has learned after 20 years to not push the question if the answer is going to be fine regardless. "We move at 9, Marcus said. 2 teams. 1 to Bennett's residence, 1 to Miller's. Gets picked up separately, different team. Different timing. We want all 3 in custody before any one of them has a chance to communicate with the others." "Phones?" Harper asked. "We've had a technical hold on their personal devices since 6 this morning through a federal warrant. They can make calls. They just can't make them to each other." "Oh, we'll try to run," Harper said. Marcus nodded slowly. "We anticipated that. There's a 3rd vehicle positioned at his residence as a precaution. If he gets in his car, he'll have a tail before he hits the end of his driveway." Harper put on his jacket. "Where am I?" "You're with me," Marcus said. "Observation position near the sheriff's department. You will watch. You will not approach. You will not speak to any of the subjects. You will not identify yourself to anyone on the scene unless I specifically authorize it." "Agreed?" "Agreed," Harper said. They looked at each other. Said, "Most people who've been through what you went through in the last 4 days would want to be the one making the arrest." "I don't need to make the arrest," Harper said. "I just need to see their faces when it happens. picked up his keys. Then let's go give you what you need. Cole Bennett was eating breakfast in his kitchen when they came for him. This detail mattered, though not for the reasons Cole might have thought it did. It mattered because of what it said about his state of mind. A man who had spent the last 48 hours in genuine, honest fear would not have been calmly eating breakfast at 8:57 in the morning. He would have been awake at 3 a.m. running calculations. He would have been on the phone. He would have been pacing. Cole Bennett was eating scrambled eggs. Because Cole Bennett had convinced himself, in the interval between Wednesday morning's meeting with Pharaoh and Thursday morning's breakfast, that this was manageable. He had been in tight spots before, things always resolved. People like him didn't go down over one impound complaint. Pharaoh's protection. He had 3 years of cases that had never gone anywhere. The system had absorbed every problem before this, and there was no reason to believe it couldn't absorb this one. He heard the knock at the door. He got up. He opened it. There were 4 of them. 2 federal agents in plain clothes with credentials already visible, and 2 uniformed officers from a neighboring jurisdiction, not his own, which was the detail that landed wrong before anything else did. Not his department, not his people. The lead agent, a calm woman in her early 40s with short brown hair and the specific, measured expression of someone who does this often enough that it has become procedure, held up her credentials. "Mr. Bennett," she said. "Federal agents. We have a warrant for your arrest." Cole stared at her. "On what charge?" he said. His voice came out steadier than he expected, and he held on to that steadiness like a man grabbing the only solid thing in a room that is moving. "Multiple charges," she said, "including theft under color of law, conspiracy, civil rights violations, and financial fraud. Are additional charges pending. Will you come with us voluntarily, or do we need to—" "I'll come voluntarily," Cole said. He said it fast, faster than he meant to, because some part of him, the part that had been eating scrambled eggs and telling himself everything was fine, had just received the information that the room was moving, and there was nothing solid to grab. He reached for his jacket on the hook beside the door. "Leave the jacket," the agent said. "We have one for you." He went without the jacket. Air hit him, and he understood, fully and completely, for the first time, that this was not a conversation. This was not something Pharaoh could absorb. This was not something that got filed and closed and forgotten. This was federal. Ryan Miller did not come to the door when they knocked. There was a 3-minute interval during which the agents at his door could hear movement inside the specific, urgent quality of movement that is not normal morning activity, but the accelerated, decision-making movement of someone who is processing options very rapidly. The lead agent on Miller's team, a tall man named Donahue, who had been in the job for 17 years and had seen every possible version of this moment, waited precisely 3 minutes and then said, in a conversational tone, loud enough to carry through the door, "Mr. Miller, the back of the property is covered. The side entrance is covered. Thinking about the garage. There are 2 agents in the alley. And to be here when you come out. The only variable right now is whether you come out the front door yourself or we come in and get you. Beaches. One of those is significantly better for you than the other." 22 seconds of silence. Then the door opened. Ryan Miller looked like a man who had aged several years in the 3 minutes since the first knock. His face was the face of someone who had earned, in that interval, performed a rapid audit of everything he had done and everything he stood to lose, and had arrived at a number that did not resolve in his favor. To Donahue, he said, "I want a lawyer." "You'll have one," Donahue said pleasantly. "Walk with us." Harper was in Marcus's sedan, parked with a clear view of the front entrance of the county sheriff's department when the call came in. He listened, said 3 words, "Copy that, good," and hung up. "Deputies in custody," he said. "Clean takedowns. No incidents." Harper nodded once. "Pharaoh in 4 minutes," Marcus said. 4 minutes Harper had spent in recent memory, not because he was unsure of the outcome. He was not unsure of the outcome, because Gerald Pharaoh represented something specific to him, the particular category of corrupt official who operates behind institutional legitimacy, who uses the tools of public trust as instruments of private extraction, who looks the community in the eye and is believed because the face and the record, the reputation have been carefully maintained over decades. Harper had brought down 4 men of that type in his career. He remembered each of them. He remembered the specific quality of their faces in the moment of arrest, not the anger, not the fear, but the thing underneath both of those, the thing that only came out in that specific moment, the recognition. The moment when a man who has been performing a version of himself for years finally runs out of stage. Buzzed. A text from Danny, words getting out, hearing. Can I tell them it's real? Harper typed back, it's real. Marcus's radio crackled. Team 3 to Webb. Is moving. He's in the vehicle. Marcus sat up slightly. South on Clearwater. He's driving fast. Shadow only. Don't intercept until he stops. Marcus looked at Harper. I know, Harper said. He won't get far. I know that too. And he did. Because wherever Farrow thought he was going, there was a federal warrant that traveled faster than any vehicle and a network of agencies that had been briefed and coordinated since Tuesday morning. Farrow was not running to freedom. He was running to the moment of arrest, just in a different location than his driveway. The radio crackled again 6 minutes later. Team 3. Subject is stopped at the county line. Fuel station on Route 12. He's out of the vehicle. A pause. He's just standing there. Something about that landed differently than Harper expected. He looked at Marcus. He stopped himself, Harper said. It's like it, Marcus said quietly. In his 30 years of work, Harper had seen men run in every possible way, literally and figuratively, by land and by legal maneuver and by influence and by simply refusing to acknowledge what was happening. He had seen men fight their arrest with everything they had. He had seen men collapse. He had seen men perform dignity they didn't possess. He had seen a handful of times men who stopped themselves, men who got a mile down the road and really understood, in a way that running had temporarily suspended, that there was nowhere to go, that the thing they had built was finished, that the performance was over. He wondered what Gerald Farrow was thinking, standing at a fuel station at the county line on a Thursday morning with federal agents closing from 3 directions. He suspected Farrow was thinking about his daughter's wedding, about the flowers the department had sent, about the Little League games and the commencement speeches and the 22 years of handshakes from people who trusted him. He was probably thinking about all the things that were real alongside all the things that weren't, and finding, maybe for the first time, that they couldn't be separated the way he'd always assumed they could, that you couldn't build a crooked thing inside a good life and expect the two to stay neatly apart forever, the radio said. Subject is cooperating. In custody, no incident. Marcus exhaled slowly. Harper said nothing for a moment. Then I want to go to the department. Marcus looked at him. Not to interfere, Harper said. I want to be there when they bring them in. I told you I needed to see their faces. Marcus studied him for a beat. He said. But Harper, when we get there, you stay back. Nothing else. Nothing else, Harper agreed. Started the sedan. They brought Cole Bennett in first. He was walked through the side entrance of the building, his own building. The place where he had worked for 6 years. He had filed reports and taken breaks and exchanged the ordinary language of colleagues with people who were now standing in the hallway, watching him walk through in federal custody. He kept his chin up. Harper noticed that. Cole Bennett, even now, was performing. The chin was up, the jaw was set, the expression was calibrated to project a man who is being wrongly subjected to a process he intends to fight. His eyes were wrong. The eyes were doing something that the rest of the face was working very hard to conceal. They were moving quickly, involuntarily, scanning faces in the hallway with the frantic calculation of a man looking for an ally, looking for someone to signal across the room that this was fixable, that there was still a lifeline. He found none, because everyone in that hallway already knew. The phones had been moving since early morning. The word had traveled through the department in the way that words always travel through close institutional communities, fast and thorough and unavoidable. And by the time Cole Bennett walked through that side entrance, was not a single person in the building who didn't already know the rough shape of what had happened. And not one of them met his eyes. Harper watched from the far end of the corridor, in a position Marcus had far enough back to be unobtrusive, close enough to see everything he had come to see. Swept the hallway one more time, and landed on Harper. The stillness that crossed Cole Bennett's face in that moment was something Harper would remember for a long time. Not the recognition. Cole wouldn't fully recognize Harper for another hour yet, wouldn't understand the full shape of who he had targeted until the identification was formally made. Crossed Cole's face was something more instinctive than recognition. It was the specific biological response of a predator who has just for the first time encountered something in the ecosystem that outranks him. Something that looked calm, something that had been watching, something that had been there the whole time. Cole looked away first. He was walked through the hallway and through the processing door and out of sight, and Harper stood where he was and felt something settle inside him that had been held in careful suspension for 4 days. Ryan Miller came in 8 minutes later. He didn't perform. He walked with his eyes down and his shoulders forward, in the manner of a man who has made a calculation and arrived at an answer he doesn't like but accepts. He did not scan the hallway. He did not look for allies. He had already decided somewhere between his front door and this corridor, that cooperation was the only remaining currency he had. He would talk. Harper could see it in the posture. Ryan Miller would talk within 24 hours, and what he said would reach into places that Bennett's pride would not allow him to go. 20 minutes after that, Marcus appeared at Harper's shoulder. "I was 10 minutes out," he said quietly. Harper nodded. The hallway had thinned slightly. Some people had gone back to their desks, the ordinary work of the department, asserting itself the way ordinary work always does, regardless of what extraordinary thing is happening in its midst. But the people who remained were the ones who needed to see it, recognize that. He had seen it before, in other buildings, other departments. When an institution is revealed to have been compromised, the people who stayed nearby to watch the accounting come due were not morbid. They were people who had needed it to be real. People who had suspected or sensed or been quietly troubled by something they couldn't name, and who needed the visible confirmation that the thing they felt was actual. He heard the vehicle before he saw anything, then the door. Gerald Farrow walked through it differently than either of his deputies. He was not performing dignity he didn't have. He was not keeping his chin up. He was not scanning for allies. He walked through that door with the specific quality of a man who has accepted the verdict before it's been formally read, because he built the thing that's being taken apart, and he understands better than anyone how completely it's being taken apart. He was 61 years old, and he looked in this moment every year of it. He walked through the hallway, and Harper watched his face. And what he saw there was not fear and not anger, but something more complicated and more final, the expression of a man confronting, in real time, the total accounting of a life that had been lived in 2 registers simultaneously, the public register and the private one, the good that was genuinely real and the harm that was equally real, and the recognition that history would now hold both and would not be inclined to separate them generously. Those eyes moved across the hallway. They landed on Harper, and unlike Cole, unlike the instinct predator-prey response, what crossed Gerald Farrow's face was recognition in a deeper sense. The face of a man who looks at another man and understands immediately, in his bones, exactly who he is looking at and what that person's presence means. Slowed his step, just slightly, just for a moment. His mouth moved. He said something, not loud enough to carry, not intended to carry, something said under his breath, to no one in particular, or possibly to himself, the private acknowledgement of a private man making his last private statement before everything became public record. Harper read his lips. Farrow said, "Of course," 2 words. Harper held his gaze for exactly as long as it took for Farrow to be walked past and through the processing door. He looked away. His phone vibrated. "Danny, Harper, tell me it happened." "It happened," Harper said. A long exhale on the other end that carried 11 years of trust and the specific relief of a man who had stood at a chain-link fence and watched something be destroyed and had chosen, against every instinct, to trust that the person beside him knew what he was doing. "Me?" Danny asked. "All 3. Silence. Then Danny said quietly, "Phil Reeves just called me. He's been sitting in his car in his driveway for the last hour. He said he couldn't go inside because his hands were shaking too much." Harper stood in the thinning hallway of the county sheriff's department and felt something move through him that he hadn't expected. Not triumph, not satisfaction, exactly. Something older and quieter than those things. Something that felt, in a way he hadn't felt in a long time, like the specific emotional weight of work that mattered finally becoming visible. "Tell Phil his bike is coming back," Harper said. "Tell all of them." Whoever was taken, the process starts now. And yours? Danny asked. Uh, Harper looked at the closed processing door. Mine isn't what matters, he said. Mine isn't what matters, he said again. Definitely. What matters is that 8 men who were told there was no recourse just found out that wasn't true. That's what I want you to tell them. Danny was quiet for a moment. You know, he said, a man who spent 30 years working in secret, actually not very good at hiding the fact that you care about people. Harper almost smiled. Don't tell anyone, he said. It'll ruin my reputation. He hung up. Marcus appeared beside him again. The way Marcus always appeared efficiently, without fanfare, in the moment when he was needed. It's done, Marcus said. Charging documents are filed. Federal jurisdiction confirmed on the financial counts. Bennett and Miller will be arraigned tomorrow morning. Farrow's attorney is already en route. The victims, Harper said. What's the timeline on restitution? Complicated, Marcus admitted. The financial investigation needs to be completed before formal restitution proceedings can begin. Realistically, we're looking at months rather than weeks. Harper, he paused. The impounded vehicles that are still intact and in county custody will be released within 72 hours. That's already in motion. Some of them were sold, Harper said, at the county auction. Those will be part of the financial restitution case, Marcus said. It won't be fast, but it will happen. Harper nodded. He understood slow justice. He had practiced it his whole life. He understood that the speed of the thing was less important than the permanence of it, that a resolution that held forever was worth more than a resolution that came fast and unraveled at the first legal challenge. He also understood the particular weariness of the people who had been waiting, the particular tax that injustice levied on ordinary people who had simply been trying to live their lives and had been targeted by men who believed that wearing a badge made them unaccountable. Tax had compounded for 36 months. Beginning today, it was being repaid. Harper said, "Yeah, thank you." Marcus looked at him sideways. "Thank me. You built this case in 72 hours from an impound yard with a camera you'd installed yourself because you'd spent 30 years knowing that something like this was always a possibility. I just made phone calls. You made 11 phone calls before 7 a.m., Harper said. That's what I do, Marcus said, simply. He picked up his jacket from his arm. I'll drive you home. They walked out of the building together into the ordinary daylight of a Thursday morning that had become, in the span of a few hours, irreversible. Behind them in the processing rooms of the county sheriff's department, 3 men were beginning the long process of understanding what accountability felt like from the other side of the desk. And in his car, in the driveway of a house 45 minutes away, a man named Phil Reeves finally stopped shaking enough to go inside. He called his wife from the front steps. It happened, he told her. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said, "Come inside. I'll make coffee." He went inside. The arraignment happened on a Friday morning, and Harper did not attend. This surprised people who knew the story. Danny had assumed Harper would be there. He had half expected a call, asking about the schedule. Even Phil Reeves, who drove to the courthouse out of his own need to see the formal beginning of the legal process, had looked around the hallway outside the courtroom, expecting to find the quiet man with the blonde gray hair and the leather vest standing somewhere in the periphery. Harper was not there. He was in his garage. He had pulled out an old motorcycle, a 1987 Harley, that he'd owned for 20 years and maintained with the careful, unhurried attention of someone who understood that some things are worth keeping even when they are no longer what they once were. And he was working on the engine with his hands and his tools and the particular silence of a man who needs to do something physical after a long period of doing something entirely internal. His phone was on the workbench. He could see it. He was not ignoring it so much as choosing deliberately and consciously not to be governed by it for a few hours. The arraignment would go the way arraignments went. Charges would be read. Attorneys would speak. Pleas would be entered. The machinery of the formal process would begin its long, precise, unglamorous work. Harper had sat in enough courtrooms in his life to know that the dramatic moment the arrest, the confrontation, revelation was always followed by the slow, procedural, deeply undramatic work of building a prosecutable case through proper channels and watching it move through a system that valued thoroughness over speed. He did not need to be there for the arraignment. He had done his part. He wiped his hands on a shop rag and looked at the old motorcycle and thought, not for the first time, that there was something clarifying about machines. They did not perform. They did not have agendas. They worked or they didn't. And if they didn't, the reason was always findable if you looked carefully enough and were willing to be honest about what you found. He wished more institutions worked that way. His phone lit up. He looked at it from across the garage, Marcus. He picked up. Bennett is talking, Marcus said without prelude. Harper set down the shop rag. Already, his attorney advised against it. He's doing it anyway. A pause that carried a specific quality, the pause of a man who has seen this before and is calibrating how much of his own reaction to let into his voice. He spent the night in a holding facility. One night, that was enough to significantly revise his understanding of his situation. He's saying, he's giving us Pharaoh, Marcus said. Everything. The system, how it was designed, who gave the instructions, who received the money, how the complaints were buried. He's laying it out like a man who has decided that the only remaining transaction available to him is cooperation, and he intends to get full value for it. Harper was quiet for a moment. Is it usable? It's corroborating what we already have from the financial trail, which means it's not just usable, it's the difference between charging Pharaoh with administrative misconduct and charging him with federal racketeering. Another pause. If Bennett's account holds up under cross-examination, Gerald Pharaoh is looking at a minimum of 12 years. The number sat in the air of the garage, 12 years. Harper thought about the community events and the Little League coaching and the 22 years of a face that people trusted. He thought about the shell company and the $400,000 and the 8 motorcycles and the tires slashed on Phil Reeves's car, and the woman who had delivered her boyfriend's account of a direct verbal threat by a uniformed deputy. About Miller, he asked. Miller requested his attorney before he said a single word and has not deviated from that position, Marcus said. Smarter about this than Bennett. He's going to wait and see what Bennett's cooperation produces before he decides what his own cooperation is worth. He'll talk eventually, Harper said. Agreed, but on his timeline, not ours. Doesn't matter between Bennett's account and the financial documentation. Miller's silence doesn't significantly change the shape of the case. Marcus paused again. How are you doing? I'm fixing a motorcycle, Harper said. That's not what I asked. Harper looked at the 1987 Harley. I know, he said. I'm fine, Marcus. You watched a machine worth $800,000 get destroyed by a man with a hammer while you stood 20 feet away and did nothing because you were building a case in your head. Real time. After 4 days of retirement-level existence. And you're fine. I've done harder things, Harper said. I know you have. That's exactly why I'm asking. A brief silence. Take the day, Harper. The machinery is running. It doesn't need you today, Harper said. He hung up. He stood in the garage for a moment. Then he picked up his tools and went back to the engine. He was not in fact entirely fine, but fine was the right operating mode for right now, and the details of not entirely could wait for a quieter moment. The story broke on Saturday morning. Not through any planned disclosure, the investigation was still active, and Marcus's team had been careful about what was released publicly and when. It broke the way things break in communities where people know each other and where the ordinary word-of-mouth infrastructure that connects neighbors and coworkers and members of shared organizations has been working since Thursday morning because 23 people had been in Big Ray's garage on Wednesday night. And while all of them had honored Harper's request to stay quiet until the process moved, the arrests were confirmed, and the arraignment was public record, the request expired. Saturday noon, the story was in 3 separate local news outlets. Saturday evening, it had been picked up by a statewide newswire. By Sunday morning, it had gone national. The angle that every journalist grabbed was the same angle, because it was the most compelling one available. A retired federal special agent, riding with the Hells Angels, had had his $800,000 custom motorcycle destroyed by corrupt deputies and had stood there silently while it happened because he was already building the case that would bring down not just the 2 men with the hammer, but the entire corrupt system they operated within. As a story, almost cinematically structured, Harper understood why journalists responded to it. It had every element that made a narrative land: the apparent underdog, the institutional villain, the hidden identity, the patient strategy, resolution that was both satisfying and morally instructive. He found it somewhat uncomfortable, personally, not because he wanted to protect his privacy that ship had sailed, not because he was embarrassed by the coverage. He didn't have much ego invested in how he was portrayed. He found it uncomfortable because the coverage, almost universally, focused on him, past, on his credentials, on the badge behind the leather vest, and the 8 men whose motorcycles had been stolen before his were mentioned in paragraph 4, if at all. Called on Sunday morning. "Have you seen the news?" he asked. "Some of it," Harper said. "You're everywhere." "I just watched a 4-minute segment on a national cable channel." "I know." "Harper, there are reporters outside the gate of the chapter's regular meeting spot. They've been there since yesterday afternoon." "I know that too. What do you want us to do?" Harper thought for a moment. "Talk about me," he said. "Talk about Phil Reeves. Talk about Marcus Lee. Talk about the man whose tires got slashed. Talk about the woman who was threatened. If someone sticks a camera in your face, those are the names you say." "Fine." A brief pause. "They're going to find you regardless." "I know," Harper said. "I'll deal with it when they do. You could get ahead of it. Do one interview. Tell your side. Control the narrative." "I spent 30 years controlling narratives as a professional strategy," Harper said. "I'm retired. Let it go where it goes." Danny made a sound that was half exasperation and half the specific admiring frustration of a man who has known someone long enough to recognize their stubbornness as inseparable from their character. "Fine," he said, "but Harper, people need to hear it from you eventually. The real version." "Maybe," Harper said. He hung up and immediately received a call from a number he didn't recognize. He let it go to voicemail. The voicemail was a producer from a national morning show. He deleted it. His phone rang again, unknown number. He let it go. Voicemail, different producer, same type of show. His phone face down on the kitchen table and made coffee and thought about the fact that he had spent 30 years being invisible by professional necessity and had now, in the span of 4 days, become the kind of story that producers called about on Sunday mornings. Patricia would have found this genuinely hilarious. He could almost hear her. "The man who never wanted credit has accidentally become famous for not wanting credit. Congratulations, William. You've achieved the most complicated version of every possible outcome." Briefly and alone in his kitchen. Then he turned his phone back over, found the number for the local news outlet that had broken the story first, a small regional paper that had been covering county government for 40 years and had the specific credibility of an institution that had outlasted every attempt to diminish it, and called them. If someone was going to tell this story, it should be told correctly. And the only way to make sure it was told correctly was to tell it himself. The reporter who answered was named Sarah Cho. She was 29, thorough, and had the quality Harper most respected in journalists. She was more interested in getting it right than getting it first. She had already verified every public record in the case before she published her initial piece, and when Harper called her directly, she was so surprised that she said, "Hold on," and he could hear her fumbling with a notebook on the other end of the line. "Mr. Harper," she said, "thank you for calling. Can I ask why me?" "Because your piece was accurate," he said. "Every fact you published, I verified. You didn't sensationalize, you didn't editorialize beyond what the facts supported. It's rarer than it should be." "Can I record this call?" she asked. "Yes," he said. "But I want to be clear about one thing before we start. This story is not about me," he said. "My history, my career, my badge, those are context. The story is about 8 men who had property stolen from them by officers who used the authority of the state to do it, and then used the same authority to silence them when they tried to report it. If your piece focuses on me, you're telling the wrong story." Pause on the other end. He could hear her writing. "Understood," she said. "Can you start by telling me about the other victims? What happened to them specifically?" He talked for an hour and 20 minutes. He gave her Phil Reeves's name, with Phil's permission, which he'd obtained by text that morning before calling. He gave her the details of every impound he knew about, every buried complaint, every instance of retaliation. He gave her the financial framework in terms that were accurate without compromising the ongoing investigation. He gave her the names of the 3 reviewing officers who had closed every complaint without action, and Pharaoh's name as the supervisor who oversaw all 3. Talked about the men in Big Ray's garage as step-turns, about the particular quality of people who had learned to accept being victimized because the system that was supposed to protect them had been deliberately configured to make them feel they had no recourse. He talked about what that does to a person over time, not just the material loss, but the erosion of the basic belief that you exist within a system that operates in good faith. He did not talk about himself more than necessary. Sarah Cho was a good enough journalist to understand that the restraint itself was part of the story. More questions, she said at the end. Go ahead. When Deputy Bennett was destroying your motorcycle, a machine worth $800,000 that you'd spent years working toward, what were you actually thinking? Not the strategic thinking. What were you feeling? Harper was quiet for a moment. I was thinking about a man named Earl Hutchinson, he said finally. Not related to Big Ray. Different man. I investigated a case involving him about 15 years ago. He'd had his business fraudulently seized by a corrupt local official. He'd spent 4 years fighting it through every legal channel available to him. And every time he got close, someone moved the goalpost. By the time we got involved, he'd lost the business. His marriage had ended under the strain, and he'd developed a drinking problem that took him another 2 years to overcome. He paused. He got his resolution eventually, Harper said. The official went to prison. Restitution was ordered. Always said the thing that hurt the most wasn't the loss of the business. It was the time. The years that were taken from him while he was fighting a system that was supposed to be on his side. So you were thinking about the time, Sarah Cho said quietly. I was thinking that every day I let that situation continue was another day those 8 men had to keep living with what had been done to them. And I was thinking that the fastest way to stop it permanently was to be patient for one more afternoon. Long silence on the line. Thank you, she said. I mean that. Write it right, he said. That's all I need. He hung up. Sarah Cho's second piece ran Monday morning. It was titled 8 Motorcycles, 1 Badge, and the System That Thought It Was Safe. He appeared 4 times. The victims' names appeared 27 times. Phil Reeves was quoted directly. Marcus Lee was quoted directly. The woman who had passed along her boyfriend's account was quoted directly, with her name included at her own insistence, the right story told correctly. By noon on Monday, it had been shared 40,000 times. By Tuesday morning, the county commissioner's office had issued a formal statement announcing an independent review of all impound proceedings in the Western District for the previous 4 years. By Tuesday afternoon, 3 members of the county council had called for the review to be expanded to include all complaint review processes under Pharaoh's supervision. By Tuesday evening, the sheriff, a man named Aldridge, who had been in the position for 11 years and who had either not known what was happening in his department or had known and said nothing and would now be called upon to explain which of those was true, held a press conference in which he looked like a man standing in a rainstorm who has just been informed that rain is wet. Harper watched the press conference on the small television in his kitchen. He watched Aldridge speak about commitment to accountability and the importance of public trust with the specific disconnected quality of a man reading from a script that someone else wrote under considerable pressure and time constraints. He watched the reporters ask questions that Aldridge was not going to answer in that setting. He watched the performance of institutional response, the careful language, the promises of cooperation, the strategic omissions, turned off the television. His phone was ringing. He looked at the screen. A number he recognized, the main line for the county commissioner's office. He answered, Mr. Harper. A man's voice, careful and professionally warm, in the way of people who make calls like this for a living. Commissioner Aldrich would like to request a meeting. At your convenience, of course. He wants to personally express, tell the commissioner, Harper said, that my convenience is currently occupied, and that what he wants to express to me personally is less important than what his office does for the 8 men whose complaints were buried for 3 years. When there's something concrete to discuss about restitution and process reform, I'll be available. I'll convey that, the aide said. Harper hung up. He did not feel satisfaction in being blunt with the commissioner's office. He felt the practical necessity of making clear, before any meeting occurred, what the meeting needed to be about. because he had spent 30 years watching institutional response to institutional failure, and he knew how it worked. The performance of contrition, then the slow, strategic minimization, the settlement offers framed as generous that were actually the minimum necessary to make the problem stop generating news. And then, if no one was watching carefully, the gradual reversion to the behavior that had caused the problem in the first place, to be watching carefully, and he was going to make sure the right people were watching with him. He called Phil Reeves on Tuesday evening. You saw the piece, Harper said. It was not a question. I saw it, Phil said. His voice had a different quality than it had carried in Big Ray's garage. Still careful, still measured, but underneath the carefulness there was something that had been there before, that the years of suppressed complaint and swallowed loss had covered over, and that was now returning cautiously. Phil Reeves sounded like a man who was beginning, slowly and with appropriate skepticism, to believe that the ground under his feet might be solid. How's your wife? Harper asked. She read the piece 3 times, Phil said. The time she read it, she started crying, not sad crying, the other kind. He paused. She said she'd been carrying the feeling that we were just the kind of people things happened to, that we didn't have the right kind of connections or the right kind of history to make a system like that respond to us. And reading that piece made her feel like maybe that wasn't true, was very still. It's not true, he said. It was never true. They just worked very hard to make it feel that way. I know that now, Phil said. I think I knew it then too. But knowing something and feeling it are different. They are, Harper agreed. My bike, Phil said. Marcus, you're Marcus. The federal contact his team called yesterday. They said the bike is in the county impound in a different facility, still intact. They're processing the release. His voice shifted. Harper, I've been without that bike for 8 months. I saved for 6 years to buy it. Harper said nothing, because there was nothing adequate to say to that. He let Phil have the silence. When I get it back, Phil said finally, I want to ride with your chapter. That's if that would be okay. You don't have to ask, Harper said. Second Saturday of every month. Show up. A breath on the other end. Phil said, okay. And Phil, Harper said, yeah, what your wife said about carrying that feeling. I want you to tell her something from me. What? The system failed you, Harper said. The people in it failed you. The system itself, the actual structure, the laws, the processes that exist to protect people those didn't fail. They were deliberately circumvented by people who thought the circumvention was safe because you didn't have the resources to fight back. He paused. What happened over the last week is what happens when someone does have those resources and points them at the right place. That's not luck. That's not special. That's what it's supposed to look like. Phil was quiet for a long moment. You're saying anyone should have been able to get this outcome, he said slowly. I'm saying everyone deserves this outcome, Harper said. And the real work, after all this settles, is making sure the gap between should have and actually does closes a little more. Another silence. You're going to keep working this, Phil said, even after the case is closed. I'm 62 years old and retired, Harper said. I have an old motorcycle, a garage, and apparently a phone that won't stop ringing. I'll find a use for some of that. Phil Reeves laughed. It was a genuine laugh, the kind that surprises the person doing it, the kind that has been held in storage for a while and emerges with the slightly startled quality of something released from pressure. I'll see you second Saturday, he said. Second Saturday, Harper confirmed. He hung up and sat for a moment with the particular quiet of a man who has just said something true and means every word of it. Wednesday brought 2 things that Harper had not anticipated. Call from Marcus. Ryan Miller talked, Marcus said. Sat up. When this morning? 6 hours after Bennett's attorney filed a formal cooperation agreement. Saw the filing, did the math, and advised Miller that the cooperation market was about to be significantly less favorable. A pause. Miller talked for 4 hours. What did he give you? Everything Bennett gave us. Independently corroborated. Miller gave us something Bennett didn't have. Marcus paused. Bennett knew the structure of the scheme. He knew how the bikes were targeted, how the impounds were processed, how the complaints were buried. What he didn't know, what Farrow apparently kept from him deliberately, was the full financial picture. Miller knew it, Harper said. Miller knew it because Miller was smarter than Bennett about what information to accumulate as protection, Marcus said. He kept records, Harper, personal records, dates, amounts, earns, account numbers, banks, transfers. He kept them as insurance, which is frankly the most competent thing either of those men did in this entire operation. And now that insurance is our evidence. How bad is the financial picture? It's not $400,000, Marcus said quietly. Over 4 years, with cases we weren't initially looking at, the total is closer to 900,000. The number was twice what they had originally assessed. Harper absorbed it the way he absorbed difficult numbers, by letting it sit for a moment, by letting its full meaning expand before he responded to it. Victims, he said. Yes, Marcus confirmed, looking at potentially 30 to 40 cases beyond the 8 you identified. Not all motorcycles, some cars, some trucks. Pharaoh's operation was broader than anyone had estimated. And he was running it across the entire Western District, not just the area where Bennett and Miller worked. He had at least 2 other deputy pairs doing the same work in different zones. Scope of it landed like a weight. Other officers, Harper said. 2 more pairs identified so far. 6 additional officers potentially involved. Marcus paused. This is no longer a case about 2 bad deputies and their captain. This is a department-wide investigation. Harper stood up from the kitchen table. He walked to the window. He stood there with his hand on the wall and looked at nothing. How many victims total, he said. It was not quite a question. It was the specific statement of a man verifying a number he does not want to be as large as he suspects it is. We don't know yet, Marcus said. We're pulling records. To take time. A pause. But conservatively, we're probably talking about 60 to 80 people over 4 years who had vehicles taken and money extracted through this system. 60 to 80 people. Harper thought about Phil Reeves in his driveway, with his hands shaking too hard to go inside. He thought about Marcus Lee in the back of Big Ray's garage, saying, I just ate the loss. He multiplied that by 80. 80 people who had been told, through the machinery of institutional authority, that they did not matter enough to fight back for. He said, yeah, we need a victim advocate who can reach all of them, document what happened to each of them specifically, and make sure they are individually represented in the restitution process. Collectively, individually. Each person's story is separate. Each person's loss is specific. I know someone, Marcus said. DOJ runs a civil rights legal organization now. I'll call her today. Good. Harper turned from the window. The 2 additional officer pairs. Are they still working? As of this morning, yes. Then they need to be suspended pending investigation. Today. Before they go out tomorrow and target someone else. I've already submitted the recommendation, Marcus said. Sheriff Aldridge is going to resist. Then tell him the alternative to suspending them. Today is having their names in the national press by Friday morning, Harper said. A pause. You know you're making a lot of decisions for a retired person, Marcus said. I know, Harper said. Are any of them wrong? A longer pause. Said, none of them are wrong. Then I'll keep making them until someone with actual authority catches up. He hung up. The second unexpected thing that Wednesday brought arrived not by phone but by knock at the door. Opened it. Standing on his front porch was a man he had never met in person, mid-50s, with the weathered, broad-shouldered build of someone who had spent a lot of years working with his hands, and a collared shirt that suggested he had dressed up for this visit. He had his hands in front of him, and he was holding something, a folded piece of paper with both of them, the way you hold something you're not entirely sure you have the right to offer. Mr. Harper, the man said, my name is Thomas Garrett. He paused. Custom, one of a kind. I've been doing it for 30 years. Harper looked at him. You drove here from where? Harper asked. Raleigh, Garrett said. 2.5 hours. Harper studied him for a moment. Come in, he said. They sat at the kitchen table, the same table where Harper had watched the footage and made the calls and planned everything that had followed. He was. 2 mugs of coffee. Thomas Garrett held his in both hands and looked like a man organizing something internally before he spoke. I saw the story, Garrett said. The original piece and the follow-up. I know who built your motorcycle. I knew the builder personally. We came up in the same world. Different shop, same community. Harper waited. I want to rebuild it, Garrett said. He put the folded paper on the table and slid it across. I'm not doing it for the publicity. I don't want to be in any story. I don't want anything with my shop's name on it that I haven't agreed to specifically. I'm doing it because he stopped. He looked at the coffee mug. I'm doing it because you protected people who didn't have protection. And because what they did to that machine it was wrong in a particular way. It wasn't just destruction, it was contempt for the work that went into it and who wanted it. He looked up. I build things. I know what it takes. I can't fix everything that happened. I can fix that. Harper looked at the folded paper. He did not open it. He looked at Thomas Garrett across the table, this man who had driven 4.5 hours and was wearing a collared shirt and was holding his coffee mug in both hands, and he thought about the particular and unpredictable ways that decency moves through the world. How it operates not through systems or structures, but through individual people who see something that needs doing and decide, without formal obligation and without guaranteed recognition, to do it. The original, Harper said quietly. Was it insured? Yes, Garrett said. Then whatever the insurance pays, you keep for your materials and your time, Harper said. I'm not letting you do this for nothing. Garrett shook his head. Insurance check is yours. It's your loss. I'll cover the bill. Consider it no, Harper said with a quiet firmness that ended the negotiation before it extended further. You will be paid fairly for your work. That is not negotiable. I've spent my whole life refusing to let the things I believe in operate on charity when they should operate on principle. I looked at him for a long moment. Okay, he said. Harper reached out and picked up the folded paper. He opened it. It was a handwritten list of specifications, component types, materials, rough timeline. Handwriting was careful and precise. The list was detailed in the way of someone who had been thinking about this for several days before making the drive. How long? Harper asked. 8 months, Garrett said. Probably 7 if nothing goes wrong. But these things always have something go wrong. 8 months is fine, Harper said. I have the old bike to ride in the meantime. I nodded to Dad. He picked up his coffee again. They sat together in a comfortable silence for a moment, the particular silence of two men who work with their hands and understand that some of the most important agreements are the ones made quietly, without ceremony. Condition, Harper said. Garrett raised his eyebrows. Ride on the finished motorcycle, Harper said, is not mine. Blinked. Whose is it? Phil Reeves, Harper said. He's been without his bike for 8 months. He saved 6 years to buy it. He's getting his bike back next week, but I want him to take the first ride on the new machine. He paused. He should know that what was done to him produced something, not just took something. Thomas Garrett looked at Harper across the kitchen table for a long moment, and he said very quietly, Good, Harper said. He picked up his coffee. Outside, somewhere down the road, a motorcycle passed the sound of its engine carrying through the walls of the house and then fading in the direction of wherever it was going. Harper listened until it was gone. Then he sat in the quiet of his kitchen and thought about 8 months and about the men in Big Ray's garage and about 60 to 80 people whose names he didn't know yet but intended to learn, and about the particular and demanding work of making sure that what had been broken got put back together, not fast, but right, always right. 8 months is a long time when you're waiting for something. It is also, Harper had learned across 62 years of living, exactly the right amount of time for the things that matter to settle into their permanent shape. Fast resolutions had a tendency to feel complete, while leaving fractures underneath the surface hairline cracks that widened under pressure months or years later. The slow ones, the ones that required patience and sustained attention, and the willingness to stay present through the unglamorous middle sections, those were the ones that held. He knew this intellectually. He had known it for decades. It did not make the 8 months easy. The first month was the busiest. His team, working with the civil rights attorney, a woman named Renata Okafor, who turned out to be exactly the kind of person the situation required, precise and relentless and deeply unimpressed by institutional resistance, identified 63 victims in the Western District over a 4-year period. 63 people who had had vehicles taken through pretextual stops, documentation dismissed, complaints buried, and in 11 documented cases, some form of retaliation applied when they pushed back. 63 separate losses that ranged from a 12-year-old pickup truck worth $4,000 to a Harper motorcycle at $800,000, with most of them clustered in the range of ordinary working people's ordinary transportation, the kind of loss that doesn't make headlines but quietly breaks the practical structure of a person's daily life. Harper read every single file Renata sent him. He did not have to. Nobody asked him to. The investigation was being professionally managed by people who were better resourced and more formally authorized to manage it than he was. He read every file because he believed that the minimum standard of human decency in a situation like this was to know the specific names and specific stories of the people who had been harmed, not as a category, not as a collective noun, as individuals. He learned that a woman named Grace Tatum had her car impounded on a Tuesday and lost her job by Thursday because she had no other way to get to work and no money to rent a vehicle while the complaint process was theoretically underway. He learned that a man named Robert Chin had been supporting his elderly mother through a medical crisis when his truck was taken, and that the 2 weeks it took him to arrange alternative transportation to her twice-weekly appointments were 2 weeks she spent without her son present during the worst period of her illness. He learned that a 23-year-old named Deshaun Morris had been stopped 3 separate times by Bennett and Miller before his motorcycle was finally taken on the 3rd stop, which suggested a pattern of targeting that went beyond opportunism into something more deliberate and more personal. He read these files at his kitchen table, and in the evenings, with 2 mugs of coffee, both of them full now, because somewhere in the first week of reading other people's losses, he had decided that the habit of setting out 2 mugs was not a wound to keep probing, but a practice of presence that he intended to keep, differently understood. Renata called him after the first week. "You've read all 63 files," she said. It wasn't a question. She had sent them with red receipts. "Yes," he said. "Why?" She asked. Not challenging, genuinely curious. "Because someone should," he said. A pause. "Harper," she said, dropping the formal address without asking, the way people do when they have decided they respect someone enough to be direct. "I've been doing civil rights work for 19 years. I have never once had a witness in a case voluntarily read every victim file independently. Not once. I'm not a witness," he said. "I'm the reason this opened. That's different. Most people who open cases like this," she said, "do it and then step back and let the professionals handle it. It's the normal thing." "I know," Harper said. "You're not going to do that." "I'm not going to interfere with your work," he said carefully. "I'm not going to step back." Another pause. Renata said, "Then let me tell you what I need from you." They talked for 2 hours. By the end of the call, Harper had agreed to provide formal affidavits for 6 of the 63 cases where his direct observations during the investigation corroborated the victim's account in ways that strengthened the legal position. He had also agreed, with more reluctance, but ultimately genuine commitment, to be a named reference in the formal complaint against the county that Renata's organization was preparing to file in federal court, not as a plaintiff, a corroborating authority whose professional history gave the complaint a credibility that would be harder for the county's legal team to strategically minimize. He was, in the language of his old career, back in the work. He had not expected that. He had expected to open the door, hand off the case, and return to his garage and his old motorcycle and his Saturday rides. He had not expected 63 files. He had not expected Renata Okafor calling him at 7 in the evening with questions that only he could answer. He had not expected that the work, once started, would reveal itself to be so much larger than the thing that had started it. And somewhere around the 3rd week, sitting at his kitchen table at 11 at night with a file open in front of him and a cup of cold coffee at his elbow, he stopped being surprised by this and accepted it as the shape his retirement had apparently decided to take. He called Marcus. "You doing all right?" Marcus asked. 63 cases in my kitchen," Harper said. "Renata told me." "Is that a problem?" "Who?" "For the investigation." "Harper, you are the most careful person I have ever worked with in 30 years of federal work. You read statute before you comment on anything. You distinguish between what you know and what you believe, and what you suspect with more precision than most attorneys I've worked with. It's not a problem." A pause. "Is it a problem for you?" Harper looked at the open file. Grace Tatum, 41 years old, lost her job on a Thursday, got it back 3 weeks later at a different company for less money because her previous employer had already filled her position. He said, "It's not a problem." "Good," Marcus said, "because I was going to tell you about something, and I didn't know how you were going to respond." Straightened slightly. "Tell me." "Renata's federal complaint," Marcus said. She filed it this morning. County is going to respond within 30 days. But the U.S. Attorney's Office reached out to us this afternoon about something separate. He paused. They want to use this case. Not just the prosecution of Bennett, Miller, and Farrow. The whole thing, the structure of the scheme, the victim documentation, the systemic complaint review shoot their failure as a model case for a broader initiative they're developing around policing accountability in smaller jurisdictions. Harper was quiet. They want to use it as a template, Marcus continued. How to identify and prosecute this type of institutional corruption, which means they need someone who can speak to the investigative methodology, the approach, how the case was built from a citizen's position rather than a federal position. He stopped. They asked about you, Harper. What exactly did they ask? Whether you'd be willing to consult, not testify. Consult. Help them understand how a retired federal investigator without official resources built a case strong enough to trigger a federal investigation within 72 hours. The kitchen was very quiet. Harper thought about the 30 years. He thought about the cases that had worked and the ones that hadn't, and the difference between, which was almost always a question of whether the person at the center of the investigation had as a full human being whose experience was worth understanding in its specificity, or as a category, a data point, a file number. He thought about the fact that he was 62 years old and had retired specifically because he had earned the right to stop, and that stopping had lasted approximately 4 days before the universe had presented him with 63 reasons to keep going. He thought about Patricia, who had known him better than he knew himself, who would have seen this coming before he did, who would have said something both cutting and deeply affectionate about the fundamental impossibility of him ever actually being finished. Tell them yes, he said. Yeah, Marcus said, with a warmth that he usually kept further back. I figured. The trials began in the spring. Cole Bennett's cooperation agreement had been finalized in November, and his formal testimony against Farrow began in April. He sat in the witness box and described in methodical, lawyer-refined detail the structure of the operation, who gave the orders, who processed the financial transfers, who reviewed and buried the complaints, who authorized the retaliation. His voice was flat, and his face was careful. And whatever Cole Bennett felt about the position he was in, he had learned, somewhere in the months between his arrest and this courtroom, to press it well enough that it didn't show. Harper sat in the gallery on the first day of Bennett's testimony. He had not planned to be there. He had told himself in the weeks leading up to the trial that his presence in the gallery was not necessary and might be a distraction. He had told himself that the case had moved into the hands of people who were fully capable of handling it, and that his job now was the parallel work with Renata and the consultation with the U.S. office, not the daily proceedings of a criminal trial. He showed up anyway. He sat in the third row of the gallery, in his regular clothes jeans, a flannel shirt, no leather vest, because this was not a statement he was making, and he did not want his presence to become a visual narrative for the journalists who were covering the trial. He sat quietly. He listened to Bennett's testimony. He watched the jury. What he was looking for, what he had come specifically to assess, was whether the jury understood, not legally, not procedurally, whether they understood in the human and moral sense what had actually happened to 63 people in a county that trusted its public servants. Renata appeared beside him during the morning recess, materializing in the gallery, with the efficient, unannounced quality that Harper had come to recognize as her particular style. Here, she said. I'm here, he confirmed. You told me you weren't coming. I changed my mind. She sat down next to him. She was carrying a leather portfolio and the specific expression of a woman who has 17 things to think about simultaneously and is choosing to set 16 of them aside for this particular moment. She said, not quite a question. Juror 4, Harper said quietly. Second row from the left. She's been taking notes since Bennett started. Not on what she's supposed to take notes on, she's been tracking the names. Every time Bennett mentions a victim by name, she writes it down. Renata turned and looked at the jury box without being obvious about it. She lost someone, Harper said. Or she's been in a position like this herself. She's not listening to this as a legal proceeding. She's listening to it as a person who understands what it means. How can you tell all that from the notes she's taking? Renata asked. because she started taking them the first time he said Phil Reeves's name. Harper said, not when he explained the financial mechanism, not when he described the complaint review process, when he said the name of the first person. Renata looked at him for a moment. You should have been a lawyer, she said. Too much talking, he said. She almost smiled. The Bennett testimony ran 4 days. Brian Miller's cooperation testimony ran 3. He was a crisper witness than Bennett, more precise, less emotionally legible, the kind of witness who gave you the facts in clean sequence without ornamentation. The financial records he had kept as personal insurance were entered into evidence on the second day of his testimony and spent 3 hours being explained by a forensic accountant whose job was to make $900,000 of fraudulent transfers comprehensible to 12 ordinary people. Harper watched the forensic accountant's testimony from the gallery and thought about Grace Tatum losing her job on a Thursday. He thought about Robert Chin and his mother's medical appointments. He thought about Deshaun Morris, who had been stopped 3 times before his motorcycle was finally taken, told Renata during his interview that after the 3rd stop, he had started taking a longer route to work, 40 minutes longer each way, because he was afraid to go past the area where the stops had happened. He had ridden that longer route for 8 months before his motorcycle was returned to him, and in those 8 months, he had spent an additional hour and 20 minutes every working day on the road, because 2 men with badges had made him afraid of a stretch of road in his own county. 63 people, $900,000, 4 years, and behind all of it, Gerald Farrow. Farrow's trial was separate and came later in the summer. He had not cooperated. He had maintained, through his attorney, that he had been unaware of the scheme, that Bennett and Miller had operated independently, that the complaint review failures were administrative oversights, that the shell company was a legitimate investment vehicle that happened to share a name with a relative's business, as a coincidence that would be explained in court. The jury took 11 hours. Harper was not in the gallery for the verdict. He was at the Rusty Anchor Diner, sitting in the back booth with Danny and Big Ray and Tommy and Phil Reeves, who had been riding with the chapter for 4 months by then and had, in those 4 months, become exactly the kind of person Harper had always known was underneath the careful, watchful exterior, someone with a dry sense of humor, strong opinions about engine maintenance, the particular generosity of a man who has been through something hard and emerged from it wanting to use the experience for something other than bitterness. Danny's phone buzzed first. He looked at it. He looked up at the table. Oh, he said, guilty, all counts. The table was quiet for a long moment. Put both hands flat on the table and stared at them. And was. Tommy looked at the ceiling. Phil Reeves reached for his coffee cup and then set it down without drinking from it, because his hands were not entirely steady, and he preferred to wait until they were. Harper sat with his hands in his lap and felt the specific and complicated weight of a conclusion that is both complete and insufficient. Complete because the legal accountability was real and permanent. Insufficient because nothing that happened in a courtroom gave Grace Tatum back the job she had lost, or restored the 2 weeks Robert Chin had not been present for his mother's appointments, returned the 8 months of longer routes that Deshaun Morris had driven, because he was afraid. The courts could produce justice. They could not produce restoration. Restoration was slower and required different tools. He had been working on those tools for 8 months. What does he get? Big Ray asked. Sentencing is in 60 days, Danny said, still looking at his phone. But the federal guidelines on the racketeering count alone, minimum 15 years, Harper said quietly. Probably more. The table absorbed this. He'll be in his mid-70s when he gets out, Tommy said. If he gets out, Danny said. Phil looked at Harper. Is it enough, he asked, not rhetorically. He genuinely wanted to know what Harper thought. Harper considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. Yes, he said. For the harm, no. Nothing is enough for the harm. That's the honest answer. But the sentence isn't supposed to undo the harm. It's supposed to signal, formally and permanently, that the harm was real and that the person who caused it is being held to account for it. He paused. The undo part, the repair part, that's what the restitution process is for. And Renata is not going to let that process be anything less than thorough. Phil nodded slowly. Carol appeared at the table without being summoned, coffee pot in hand, and refilled every cup without comment. She had been working at the Rusty Anchor long enough to understand when a table needed coffee and when it needed to be left alone. And she had an unerring instinct for which was which. Carol, Danny said, you following this case? The whole county's been following this case, she said, without stopping her pour. You all want pie? The table looked at each other. Big Ray said, we want pie. The institution process, as Harper had promised Phil Reeves, was thorough. Nada Okafor turned out to be exactly the kind of attorney that 63 people needed, the kind who understood that the legal process was not the end of her responsibility, but the framework within which her actual responsibility operated. She filed individual restitution claims for all 63 victims. She fought the county's initial settlement offer, which was, as Harper had predicted it would be, the minimum amount calculated to make the news cycle move on with the specific and documented energy of a woman who had read every one of those 63 files herself and was not interested in collective arithmetic. She called Harper every week for 6 months, sometimes for information, sometimes for his perspective on a strategic decision. Sometimes he suspected simply because she had spent a week fighting institutional inertia and needed to talk to someone who would not tell her she was being unreasonable. He was never not available for those calls. The county's attorney told me today, she said one evening in October, that they consider the restitution offers fair in aggregate. Aggregate, Harper said, his exact words. What did you say? I told him that the harm was not suffered in aggregate, Renata said. Suffered individually by 63 specific people with specific losses and specific lives, and that any resolution that could not look each of those 63 people in the eye and say their specific harm was specifically addressed was not a resolution I was prepared to accept on their behalf. Quiet for a moment. And he said he'd take it back to his clients. A pause. He looked like a man who had just realized he was in a longer conversation than he'd planned for. Good, Harper said. Harper. He's going to come back with a better number, she said. I'm almost certain. But I want you to know, when he does, I'm going to recommend that the 63 accept it, because a good settlement today is worth more to most of them than the possibility of a better settlement after 2 more years of litigation. I know, Harper said. You agree? I agree, he said. Nada. I trust your judgment on this. That's not a complicated thing for me to say. Trust your judgment. A pause. You know, she said, in 19 years, I have had exactly 3 clients who trusted my judgment without conditions. Not a client, he said. I know, she said. That's part of why I'm telling you. The county came back with a better number 3 weeks later. Renata reviewed it, adjusted 2 line items through a brisk and efficient negotiation that cost the county an additional $80,000 and took 90 minutes, and then recommended acceptance to the 63. 62 of them accepted. One to Sean Morris, the 23-year-old who had been stopped 3 times and had driven a longer route for 8 months because he was afraid decline. He told Renata he wanted to go to trial. He wanted a jury to hear what had happened to him specifically. He wanted it on formal public record that he had been targeted, that his fear was real, and that the months of longer routes and the hours spent on roads he didn't want to be on were not a minor inconvenience, but a fundamental violation of his right to move through his own county without being afraid. Renata told Harper about Deshawn's decision on a Tuesday evening. What do you think? She asked. I think he's right, Harper said immediately. It will take at least a year, maybe 2. I know. He understands the risks. Renata, Harper said, a 23-year-old man decided he would rather spend 2 years fighting for the formal recognition of his specific harm than accept money that didn't acknowledge it. That's not a risk calculation. That's a moral position. A silence. Okay, she said. Stand beside him, Harper said. All the way. I intend to, she said. Thomas Garrett called on a Wednesday in November, 8 months, and 4 days after he had sat at Harper's kitchen table with his hands around a coffee mug and a handwritten list of specifications. It's done, he said. Harper set down the file he was reading. He said, done. I'd like to bring it to you. Garrett paused. I want to bring it in person. And if that's okay. That's okay, Harper said. Friday? Friday, Harper confirmed. He called Phil Reeves after he hung up. Friday, he said. Garrett's bringing the motorcycle. Phil was quiet for a moment. You still want me there? I told you 8 months ago, Harper said. First ride is yours. It hasn't changed. Another pause. Harper, Phil said. I've been thinking about this for 8 months. about what you said, that what was done to me produced something, not just took something. And I've been trying to understand what you meant by that. Because on one level, I know what you meant. I know the case it opened and the people it helped. I keep coming back to something simpler. He stopped. What you meant was that it produced this, didn't it? The chapter, the people in Ray's garage. Nada. Deshaun Morris fighting his case. His voice was careful and precise, the way it always was when he was saying something he had thought about for a long time. All of this started because two men destroyed your motorcycle and picked the wrong man to target, Harper said quietly. Phil waited. All of this started, Harper said, because the people those two men targeted before me didn't have the resources to fight back. I just happened to have what they needed. The beginning wasn't my motorcycle. The beginning was the first person they ever stopped who couldn't do anything about it. He paused. I don't want you or anyone else to think that what happened here was about me being special. I want you to understand that 63 ordinary people deserved this outcome before I was ever involved. My job was just to open the door. Phil was silent for a long time. When he spoke, his voice was rough in the way voices get when the emotion in them is genuine and the person is not performing anything. Friday, he said. Friday, Harper confirmed. Friday came cold and clear, the kind of November morning that smells like leaves and distance, and the particular freedom of a road that is yours to travel. Thomas Garrett arrived at 10 in the morning in a covered trailer pulled by a truck that had seen better decades and didn't care. He backed the trailer into Harper's driveway with the practiced efficiency of a man who has moved custom motorcycles professionally for 30 years and has stopped being nervous about the backing in part. Was there Big Ray, Tommy, Phil Reeves, who had arrived 20 minutes early and was standing in the driveway with his hands in his jacket pockets and an expression that he was not quite managing to keep neutral. Webb had driven up the evening before and slept in the guest room that Harper had quietly prepared without making it a statement. He was standing near the garage door with a coffee mug, and when Garrett began unlocking the trailer, Marcus caught Harper's eye across the driveway and gave him a nod that carried the specific compressed meaning of men who have worked together long enough that entire conversations can happen in a single look. Opened the trailer. The motorcycle that came out of it was not identical to the one that had been destroyed. It could not be, because Thomas Garrett was not the original builder and did not believe in copying another craftsman's work. It was something that honored the original, the same philosophy of design, the same attention to the relationship between function and beauty, the same quality of materials and craftsmanship, while being unmistakably its own thing. Something new, something that had come out of a bad event and been made because of it, not in spite of it. As these things go, extraordinary. Big Ray made a sound that was not a word. Tommy walked forward and then stopped himself because it was not his to touch. Phil Reeves stood very still. Harper looked at it for a long moment. He looked at the chrome in the custom frame and the paint that Garrett had chosen, a deep, almost navy blue that shifted toward black in the shadow and toward something luminous in the light, a color that Harper had described to Garrett simply as the color of early morning on an open highway, and that Garrett had apparently understood perfectly. He looked at it for exactly as long as he needed to. Then he turned to Phil. Phil was looking at the motorcycle with the expression of a man who is holding several things at once. The 8 months the drive, his wife on the phone, the file he had been in, the longer routes, the feeling of standing in Big Ray's garage and hearing Harper say, "I need you to trust me," and who is finding that all of those things are arriving simultaneously and do not resolve into a single clean emotion, into something more complicated and more true. "Oh," Harper said. Phil looked at him. "It's yours," Harper said. "Forever, for this morning. For the first ride. In the way that mattered, the symbolic, irreversible, permanent way, it was his. The first person to take that machine onto the open road was the person whose relationship to it would define what it meant. And Harper had known, from the moment he told Thomas Garrett about Phil Reeves, that the meaning needed to belong to someone for whom the ride was not a luxury but a return. Phil walked to the motorcycle. He put his hands on the handlebars, both of them, the way you put your hands on something you intend to be responsible for. He looked down at the machine. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, without looking up, "Thank you." Not to Harper specifically. to the driveway, to the morning, to whatever chain of events had brought him from his own driveway 8 months ago. With shaking hands to this one, Harper said nothing. Because some moments are complete without addition. Phil swung his leg over. He sat in the seat. He took a breath that everyone in the driveway heard without being able to explain why they heard it as clearly as they did. He started the engine. The sound of it was clean and deep and carried in the cold November air the way certain sounds carry farther than they should, longer than they need to, as if the morning itself was making room for it. Phil took the motorcycle to the end of the driveway, onto the road, and he rode. Harper watched him go. He watched the motorcycle until it was out of sight, and then stood listening to the engine until that too was gone, replaced by the ordinary sounds of a Friday morning in November, wind in the trees, a dog somewhere down the road, quiet of a neighborhood going about its life. Danny appeared beside him. "Hey?" Danny asked. "Yes," Harper said.
You sure?
"I'm sure." He looked at the empty road. "Danny, do you know what the hardest thing about this job was?" "The real job. Years." Danny shook his head. "Watching people be treated as less than they were," Harper said. "Watching people accept that treatment because they thought they had no other choice. Watching the gap between what people deserved and what they got, and spending years building cases that were supposed to close that gap, and knowing that even when the case worked, it came in, and the sentence was handed, the gap was still there." He paused. "It's still there. Deshaun Morris is still fighting. 62 people have settlements that are fair, but not complete. Ace Tatum still took a pay cut when she came back from losing her job," and looked at Danny. "But Phil Reeves is on that road," he said. "And that matters. That is not nothing. That is a man who spent 8 months afraid to believe the ground was solid, and today the ground held." Danny looked at him for a long moment. "You're going to keep going, aren't you?" he said. "Quite a question. The consulting, the work with Renata, not going to actually retire." "I retired," Harper said. "Retirement turned out to have a different shape than I expected. Does that bother you?" Harper considered this honestly. He said, "I thought it would. I thought I wanted the garage and the old bike and the Saturday rides and nothing else." He looked at the empty road again. "Turns out the Saturday rides mean more when you know why you're on the road, when you know what you were doing during the week. That makes the weekend worth having." Marcus appeared on his other side. "Phil's going to be back in about 20 minutes, Marcus said. "And I told Carol at the diner we'd be in for lunch. She said she'd have pie." "Of course she will," Harper said. He stood between Danny and Marcus in his own driveway on a cold Friday morning, and he felt the specific warmth of a life that has not gone the way you planned and is better for it. His phone vibrated. He looked at it. A text from Renata. "Deshaun Morris's trial date confirmed. 14. He says, thank you for telling me to stand beside him." Per typed back, "Tell him the road is long, but it holds." He pocketed the phone. Phil came back down the road 7 minutes later, earlier than expected. Not because the ride was short, but because he had apparently decided, somewhere in those 7 minutes, that what he needed was not more road, but to come back and be among the people who had made the morning possible. He pulled into the driveway. He sat on the motorcycle for a moment without getting off. Then he looked at Harper. "It's a good machine," he said. Harper said, "It is." Phil got off the motorcycle carefully, the way you get off something you intend to take good care of. He stood beside it. He looked at the group in the driveway, Danny, Big Ray, Tommy, Marcus, Thomas Garrett standing near his trailer with his hands in his pockets. And his face had the open, unguarded quality of a man who has put down something heavy and is noticing, time in a while, how it feels to stand upright without the weight. Looked at all of them. At the men he had ridden with for 11 years, who had never needed him to explain himself. At Marcus, who had made 11 calls before 7 in the morning. At Thomas Garrett, who had driven 4.5 hours in a collared shirt. At Phil Reeves, standing in a driveway with steady hands. He thought about the quiet old biker standing at a chain-link fence, while his dream was destroyed by 2 men who believed a badge made them untouchable. He thought about what those men had not understood. A badge is not power. Authority is not strength. The ability to harm is not the same as the right to act. And the quietest person in a room is not always the least dangerous one. Sometimes the most dangerous person is the one who has spent 30 years learning exactly when to be patient and exactly when to move. And sometimes the thing they destroy on a Tuesday afternoon is the very thing that opens every door they thought was locked. William Harper looked at the road. He thought about Patricia. He thought, you were right. I always find the complicated way to do the simple thing. He also thought, the complicated way got 63 people hurt. The complicated way put Gerald Farrow in a courtroom. The complicated way brought Phil Reeves to this driveway on a Friday morning with steady hands. Some roads are long because they have to be. Some things take the time they take because the outcome requires it. And the man who understands that, who has the patience to wait for the right moment and the courage to act when it comes, does not need to be the loudest voice in the room, does not need to announce his power before he uses it, does not need the approval of the people he's about to hold accountable. He only needs to know who he is. William Harper knew exactly who he was. He had known for 30 years. And now on a cold Friday morning in November, with the sound of a motorcycle fading into the distance and the smell of coffee coming from inside the house, and 63 people whose lives had moved closer to whole, that knowledge settled into him with the permanent, unshakable weight of a truth that has been tested by everything and held by all of it. He was a man who showed up. That had always been enough. That would always be enough.